Accounting 46, Sustainability and Strategic Audit. Managing the Internal Audit Activity, Lecture 2. The following are the learning objectives. At the end of this discussion, the students should be able to obtain comprehensive knowledge of how to manage the internal audit activity, to know the specific responsibilities of the Chief Audit Executive in managing the internal audit activity. Note the importance of proper positioning of the internal audit function within the organization. Discuss how technology is used in the management of the internal audit function, and explain the importance of quality assurance and improvement program. Chief Audit Executive, a senior position within the organization responsible for internal audit activities. The term also includes titles such as General Auditor, Head of Internal Audit, Chief Internal Auditor, Internal Audit Director, and Inspector General. Sa loob ng isang kumpanya, merong internal audit team or internal audit department. Yung head nun, yun yung tinatawag na Chief Audit Executive. Si Chief Audit Executive, siya yung magre-represent as head of the internal audit team. The Chief Audit Executive would be responsible for the internal audit activities as a whole. Organizations that recognize the importance of placing the internal audit function in a position that maximizes its effectiveness and ability to evaluate efficacy of the risk management control and governance processes that are in place often do so through a senior management position described in the standards as a CAE or Chief Audit Executive. IIA Standard 2000, Managing the Internal Audit Activity, states that the Chief Audit Executive must effectively manage the internal audit activity to ensure it adds value to the organization. Kasi baka, merong internal audit team yung organization pero actually wala siyang natutulong sa pag-improve ng processes ng risk management, ng control and governance processes within the organization. Recognizing that the CAE is pivotal to a successful internal audit function, the interpretation of Standard 2000 goes on to state that the internal audit function is effectively managed when. So, kailan natin masasabi that internal audit is effectively managed? So, first, the results of the internal audit functions work achieve the purpose and responsibility included in the internal audit charter. And the internal audit charter, nandun lahat yung purpose, yung objectives na internal audit team. So, dapat na-achieve yun ni internal audit department or the internal audit team. So, the results of the internal audit work achieve the purpose and responsibility included in the internal audit charter. Next, the internal audit function conforms with the standards. So, we have accounting standards. So, the internal audit function should conform with the, auditing standards or the accounting standards, whichever is applicable. Next, the individuals who are part of the internal audit function demonstrate conformance with the Code of Ethics and the standards. So, we have Code of Ethics for the internal auditors and the standards based on what they are auditing. So, for example, they are auditing the processes of the organization. So, yung standard nila, ano ba yung standard process ng organization? Next, the internal audit activity functions considers trends and emerging issues that could impact the effectiveness of the internal audit function. So, not only the existing risk or the existing issues, but also the potential issues that the company may face. Internal Audit Charter is a formal written document that defines the internal audit function's purpose, authority, and responsibility. The Internal Audit Charter is subordinate to the Audit Committee's Charter. So again, nasa Internal Audit Charter, lahat ng responsibilities, rules, and function ng internal audit team. So ngayon, we can say that the internal audit is effectively managed when the purpose and responsibility that are written in the internal audit is achieved or are achieved through the internal audit work. Again, yung resulta ng internal audit work, ng internal audit team, achieve the purpose, responsibilities, or role na nakalagay sa internal audit charter. Therefore, masasabi natin na si internal audit activities within the organization is effectively managed. Sabi dito, the internal audit charter is subordinate to the audit committee's charter. Kasi audit committee's charter is mas mataas yung position nila kasi sa internal audit. Si audit committee's charter, si audit committee kasi is from the board of director mismo, kinuha yung representative ng audit committee. So, subordinate lang si internal audit charter kay audit committee charter. Let's talk about the internal audit charter. Ang sabi nga, internal audit charter is a formal written internal audit charter is essential in managing the internal audit function. Kasi kung walang ganito, walang fixed na role, walang fixed na function si internal audit team. The internal audit charter provides formal criteria for review and understanding by management, as documented in the minutes by the audit committee. It also facilitates a periodic assessment of the adequacy of the internal audit functions, purpose, authority, and responsibility, which establishes the role of the internal audit function. The internal audit charter provides a formal written agreement with management and the audit committee regarding the organization's internal audit function. Number 2, the chief audit executive is responsible for periodically assessing whether the internal audit functions, purpose, authority, and responsibility as defined in the internal audit charter, kasi lahat ng function, purpose, authority, and responsibility ng internal audit team or department or committee is nakalagay lahat sa internal audit charter. Since the CAE is the head of the internal audit, so therefore, he is responsible in assessing whether na-achieve ba yung purpose, yung authority, or yung responsibility nila na nakalagay sa internal audit charter. If it continued to be adequate to enable the internal audit function to accomplish its objectives. The CAE is also responsible for communicating the result of this assessment to management and the audit committee. Since the CAE is the head of the internal audit team or the internal audit department, he is responsible to communicate any assessment. For example, na-assess niya na hindi na-achieve yung objective, hindi na-achieve yung responsibility ni internal audit. Okay? So, therefore, he will report to the management and to the audit committee. Individual objectivity. An unbiased mental attitude that allows internal auditors to perform engagements in such a manner that they have an honest belief in their work product and that no significant quality compromises are made. Objectivity requires internal auditors not to subordinate their judgment on audit matters to that of others. So, pag sinabi nating individual objectivity, the judgment of the auditor is unbiased, free from bias. Organizational independence. The chief audit executive's line of reporting within the organization that allows the internal audit function to fulfill its responsibilities free from interference. The internal audit function should be separate or independent from any part of the organization. For example, of the management. So, the internal audit function or the internal audit team should be separated from the managerial function so that they will fulfill their responsibility as the internal auditor of the organization. Kasi kung hindi sila independent with the management, then therefore hindi natin masasabi na objective yung audit or result of audit or the audit work of the internal audit team. Kasi nga, they are not independent with the management. If for example, yung ini-audit is the management itself mismo, edi paano kung ganun? Ikaw yung the management, sila yung humahawak na internal audit function, sila din yung audit, yung process. So therefore, hindi pwede na ikaw auditor, ini-audit mo yung sarili mo. Again, so the internal audit function must maintain the independence within the organization. IIA Standard 1120, individual objectivity states internal auditor must have an impartial, unbiased attitude and avoid any conflict of interest. The implementation guide for this standard further outlines these requirements. Conflict of interest is a situation in which an internal auditor, who is in a position of trust, has a competing professional or personal interest. Such competing interests can make it difficult to fulfill his or her duties impartially. For example, part siya ng internal audit team. He is an internal auditor. However, he is also the supplier of the raw materials of the organization. Ngayon, nung inaudit na yung production process, nalaman na substandard yung mga raw materials or hindi siya akma suitable dun sa product ni company mismo. So therefore, since ikaw, alam mo si internal auditor, ikaw yung supplier, syempre, conflict dun sa gusto mo ng man na customer pa rin si company. 'Di ba? For example, meron kang business providing the raw materials to the organization. So, magko-conflict yung dalawa. Your competing personal interest. Magsusupply ka ng raw materials within the organization and at the same time as internal auditor dahil nalaman mo na hindi suitable yung raw materials na yon or hindi akma or substandard siya para sa product ni organization. Therefore, hindi dapat yun yung in-order or kinukuha ni organization. So, dapat maghanap ng ibang supplier. However, mag-conflict siya sa internal auditor since siya yung supplier, existing supplier ni company. So, it would be difficult for the internal auditor to fulfill his or her duties impartially. Kasi pwede na dahil dun sa interest niya, personal interest niya, hindi niya na lang i-report yung nakitang problema within the production process. Okay, let's continue. A conflict of interest exists even if no unethical or improper act results. A conflict of interest can create an appearance of impropriety that can undermine confidence in the internal auditor, the internal audit activity in the profession. A conflict of interest could impair an individual's ability to perform his or her duties and responsibilities objectively. Impairment to organizational independence and individual objectivity may include but is not limited to personal conflict of interest, scope limitations, restriction on access to records, personal and properties, and resource limitations such as funding. The determination of appropriate parties to which the details of an impairment to independence or objectivity must be disclosed is dependent upon the expectation of the internal audit activities and the chief audit executive responsibilities to senior management and the board as described in the internal audit charter, as well as the nature of the impairment. So, pwedeng ma-impair yung independence, organizational independence, and individual objectivity because of conflict of interest, yung sinabi natin kanina, scope limitations, restriction and access to records, hindi lahat ng information na kailangan binibigay, personnel, kulang, and properties and resource limitations such as funding, kulang ng fund, to do the work of the internal audit. Should an impairment to independence or objectivity be identified, the internal auditor must report the impairment or perceived impairment to the CAE, who must decide if the internal auditor needs to be reassigned. When the impairment results from a scope limitation, the CAE must report such limitation to the audit committee. So, for example, na-impair yung independence or objectivity kasi si internal auditor is merong conflict of interest mismo dun sa subject ng audit. Therefore, si CAE as the head of the internal audit function, as the head of the internal audit department, must decide kung si internal auditor ba na yan needs to be reassigned sa ibang department or kailangan paalisin or kailangan ilagay sa ibang department. When the impairment results from a scope limitation, meaning wala namang conflict of interest, hindi naman kasalanan ni internal auditor, may scope of limitation lang talaga. Ano yung scope limitation? Scope limitation kasi, okay, nalilimitahan yung scope ng audit kasi kulang ng records, kulang ng information. For example, kailangan ng record ng mga ganito kaso hindi pala gumagawa ng ganong report sa entity. So, therefore, merong scope limitation tayo. Gusto malaman ni internal auditor yung mga ganitong items, yung mga ganitong reports, yung mga ganitong records. However, hindi pala nagkikip ng ganyang records si company. Therefore, merong scope limitation. So, the CAE must report such limitation to the audit committee. Standard 1130A1. Internal auditor must refrain from assessing specific operation for which they were previously responsible. Objectivity is presumed to be impaired if an auditor provides assurance services for an activity for which the auditor had responsibility within the previous year. Pag auditor kasi tinitingnan natin kung may mali ba, may kailangan bang i-improve, ina-assess natin mismo yung subject ng audit. So, hindi pwede na si internal auditor, ina-audit niya yung sarili niya. Kasi ang tendency, baka ma-impair si objectivity. Since ina-audit ni internal auditor yung sarili niyang gawa, yung own work niya. So, therefore, ang tendency, kahit mali yan, kahit subject to improvement dapat yan, ang tendency, baka i-report niya as effective yung work, or effective yung process, or effective yung activities. Again, kaya nga sinabi dito, objectivity is presumed to be impaired if an auditor provides assurance services for an activity for which the auditor had responsibility within the previous year. Yung activity na yon, siya yung responsible nun for the previous year. Ngayon, ina-assess niya na. Binibigyan niya na ng assurance services. Na effective yun, ganito, ganyan. So, ang tendency, may impair yung objectivity. Next, Standards 1130A2. Assurance engagement for functions over which the Chief Audit Executive has responsibility must be overseen by a party outside the internal audit activity. The same principle sa 1130A1. So ngayon, kung responsible si CAE, hindi pwede na siya din ang mag-audit sa sarili niya. If CAE has the responsibility for a certain function, it must be seen by a party outside the internal audit activity. Pwedeng external parties or ibang party, the audit committee, pero hindi pwede na si CAE pa din or si internal audit team pa din ang magbigay ng assurance engagement for functions na sila rin ang gumawa. Again, hindi nila pwede i-audit yung sarili nila. So, dapat may mag-oversee, may mag-monitor nun outside from the internal audit activity. Standard 1130A3. The internal audit activity may provide assurance services where they had previously performed consulting services provided the nature of the consulting did not impair objectivity, and provided individual objectivity is managed when assigning resources to the engagement. Yung consulting services kasi is different from the assurance services. Kasi yung consulting services, okay, ibig sabihin, yun yung service ni auditor na focus sa pagbibigay ng advices or opinion sa management para ma-improve niya yung processes niya, yung activities niya. Yung assurance services naman, ito yung function ni internal audit wherein nagpo-provide siya ng assessment or evaluation kung sinusunod ba, effectively manage ba yung processes, okay, kung sinusunod ba yung dapat na process, okay? So, tama ba lahat? So, tinitingnan niya kung nakapasa ba dun sa standard or dun sa criteria mismo. Yun yung assurance services. Okay? Evaluating or assessing mismo the performance. While consulting services involves na siya in suggesting, okay, helping the company to improve, nagko-consult na siya. So, provided the nature of the consulting did not impair objectivity, so pwede na sa internal audit activity will provide both the assurance and the consulting services as long as walang conflict between the two services na ipoprovide the internal audit. For example, magbibigay ng assurance service si internal audit team sa operation ni entity. And at the same time, magbibigay siya ng consulting service, tax services, para sa company. Okay? So, hindi naman conflict yung dalawa. It would not impair the objectivity of the internal audit function of the organization. So, therefore, pwede. Internal auditors may provide consulting services relating to operation for which they had previous responsibilities. So, pwede sila mag-provide ng consulting services relating to operations, but they cannot provide assurance services for which they had previous responsibilities. Kasi pag assurance, meaning ina-assess natin, ina-evaluate natin yung performance. So, tinitingnan kung may mali ba, kung may error, kung mayroong failure, dun sa responsibility or sa activity na nangyari na. So, evaluation na yon. Etong consulting services naman, syempre, we are just looking to some points dun sa nangyari para ma-improve. Kasi when we say consulting services, kino-consult lang ni internal auditors yung company, yung organization, or yung management kung ano bang dapat gawin within the organization, kung ano pa bang dapat i-improve. Standard 1130.C2, if internal auditors have potential impairments to independence or objectivity relating to proposed consulting services, disclosure must be made to the engagement client prior to accepting the engagement. So, if there is impairment of the objectivity ng internal auditors, disclosure must be made to the engagement client. Sino yung engagement client? Si organization mismo, si management. So, kailangan sabihin muna kay management. So, for example, yung proposed consulting services is supplier regarding sa change of supplier ng organization. So, pwede na ma-impair yung objectivity. Kasi nga, for example, pabor or favorable yun para sa one of the internal auditors or CAE mismo ng company. Kasi siya yung magso-supply. Supplier siya ng ganitong raw materials. Gusto niya sa kanya. Kasi nga, okay, gusto niya rin. Kasi maganda rin naman, for example, yung raw materials. For example, ganito Okay, sa consulting services, gusto i-consult ni internal auditor si management na mag-change ng supplier dun tayo sa mas mura pero kalidad na raw materials. However, okay, it may impair the independence lang or objectivity of the internal auditors kasi nga, one of the internal audit team pala is yun mismo yung supplier na tinutukoy within dun sa decision nila na mag-change ng supplier. So, siya yung tinutukoy na bagong supplier ni organization. So, before yan mangyari, so sabihin muna sa engagement client, disclosure must be made to the engagement client, okay? So, merong propose na bagong supplier, however, is part of the internal audit team, so it may impair the objectivity of the internal auditors. So, yun lang, disclosure must be made to the engagement client. So, once na inform na, okay, it's up to the engagement client if he will accept the engagement or the consultation services or not. Proficiency and due professional care. Proficiency and due professional care states simply that engagement must be performed with proficiency and due professional care. Proficiency goes into more detail, stating that internal auditor must possess the knowledge, skills, and other competencies needed to perform their individual responsibilities. So, when we say proficiency, meaning meron siyang background, meron siyang experience when it comes to internal auditing, and at the same time, meron siyang certification. For example, he is a certified internal auditor, CIA or CMA. So, proficiency. Nakakita mo yung pagiging professional ng internal auditor. The internal audit activity collectively must possess or retain the knowledge, skills, and other competencies needed to perform its responsibilities. So, ongoing, continuous yung training, yung acquisition of knowledge and skills ni internal auditors. Furthermore, IIA Standard 1220, Due Professional Care, states that internal auditor must apply the care and skill expected of a reasonably prudent and competent internal auditor. Due professional care does not imply infallibility. So again, they are concerned on their profession. So dapat necessary care and skill expected of them, but at the same time, they are professional enough or competent enough as an internal auditor. As previously mentioned, the CAE is responsible for creating an operating budget and allocating resources in a manner designed to accomplish the annual internal audit plan. The annual plan is developed by the internal audit function through a process that identifies and prioritizes possible audit entities, business unit, or processes referred to as the audit universe, responsible for mitigating key strategic operation reporting and compliance risk to levels acceptable to organization, board of directors, and senior management. So, anong ibig sabihin? Ibig sabihin, si CAE, siya yung responsible of allocating the resources na binudget for the internal audit work. For example, merong budget for the internal audit work, so the CAE must identify or i-allocate niya kasi yung resources na yan to different processes. Okay, to different sections na kailangan i-audit ni internal audit team. Key risks are those confronting the organization that must be controlled and monitored for an organization to successfully accomplish its defined business objective. So this risk, as identified by senior management, should be independently corroborated by the internal audit functions. So, kailangan i-identify ni CAE and the internal audit team yung mga existing and potential risk na na-identify na ni senior management. Okay? So, mag-a-assist din naman si internal audit ng mga risk sa company. But at the same time, kailangan niya din malaman yung na-assess na risk ni senior management. Ngayon, pag na-assess na yung risk, nalaman na, na-identify na yung risk, key risk, dun sa objectives ng organization, the CAE determines which specific business units and processes are responsible for mitigating this risk. Okay? So, titingnan na CAE, sino ba ang responsible sa risk na to? Sino ba dapat ang mag-take ng action para ma-mitigate yung risk na to? So, again, first identify the risk. Okay? So, kailangan malaman ni CAE, the internal audit, yung mga identified risk na ni senior management. After the risk has been identified, so kailangan malaman kung sino ang responsible for mitigating those risks. The resulting information is then subject to a process that prioritizes and ranks the risk and associated business units or processes. So the CAE considers all of this information and determines the human and financial resources necessary to provide appropriate audit coverage of the prioritized audit universe. Again, ano yung audit universe? Yun yung lahat na pwedeng maging subject to audit. Okay? Yung possible audit entities. Ano yung mga possible processes na i-audit ni internal audit. Okay, so after na-identify yung risk, okay, madidetermine yung specific business process na responsible for mitigating those risks. And then, the resulting information is the subject to a process na inirarank natin. Ano bang mas importante? Okay? Kasi nga, pag nagbabudget tayo, di ba? Pag nagbabudget, kailangan alamin ko ano yung pinaka-importante muna. So, i-prioritize muna ni CAE. Ano yung mas importante? Ano yung mas significant risk na kailangan kaagad i-mitigate? Okay, para ma-allocate ng resources. After nun, i-consider lahat ni CAE, pati yung human and financial resources, yung mga tao within the internal audit team. I-assign yan dun sa subject ng audit. Necessary to provide appropriate audit coverage of the prioritized na mga audit objects. The result is a comprehensive internal audit plan that includes both the assurance services and consulting services necessary to assess how effectively the organization is managing the risk that threaten its business objectives and to identify risk management improvement opportunities. Okay, pag na-allocate na lahat, kasi sa internal audit, hindi lang naman pera yung ina-allocate natin. Na-allocate natin pati yung human resources. And at the same time, yung mga other resources. Sino yung naka-assign dito? Okay? Ano yung time coverage dito? Pati yung time, nasa internal audit plan yun. Okay, ilan ang budget dito? So, nandun lahat yun sa internal audit plan. So, the internal audit plan includes both the assurance services and consulting services. Again, sinabi ko kanina, si assurance services, ina-assess niya, ina-evaluate niya how effectively the organization is managing the risk. Okay, so pwede niya sabihin, pwedeng mag-conclude. Pag nag-provide ng assurance services internal auditors, pwede niya i-conclude, okay, the entity or the organization is not managing his risk or the risk effectively. So, pwedeng ganun. Ina-assess niya lang, nagbibigay lang siya ng conclusion. However, yung consulting services naman, ina-identify niya yung possible risk management improvement opportunities. Kinoconsult niya mismo si company, nagbibigay siya ng advices. The audit plan can then be implemented by assigning specific personnel to individual engagement and the plan over the following fiscal year. Ito yung allocating the human resources. Internal audit function will implement and assign resources to execute the internal audit plan throughout the fiscal year, and many will update and recast the internal audit plan more frequently than annually. So again, yung internal audit plan kasi hindi yan fixed. Continually changing yung internal audit plan. Nasa internal audit plan kasi, it will be discussed deeper sa mga susunod na lectures. Pero nandito sa internal audit plan, nandito yung budget kasi ni organization pagdating sa internal audit. Yung pera, yung financial, yung human resources, yung time, yung budgeted time, sino ang magsusupervise nito, sino ang mga naka-assign dito. So, nandun lahat sa internal audit plan. So, sa internal audit plan, sa annual plan mismo na internal audit function, dapat tinitingnan nila kung ano yung mga risk, ano yung mga processes na kailangan mo na unahin. So, prioritize natin, nirarank natin yung mga risk, yung mga business units or processes na significant sa success, sa improvement ng organization as a whole. An internal audit plan. So, what is internal audit plan nga ba? An outline of the specific assurance and consulting engagement scheduled for a period of time, typically 1 year, based on an assessment of organization risk. Again, as we have discussed kanina, in-assess natin yung risk. Ngayon, we identify sino yung responsible for mitigating that risk. E ngayon, nandun sa internal audit plan, ano yung gagawin within the whole year, within the annual period ni internal audit team. Okay, ano yung plano? So, from the assessment ng risk, to the gathering of evidence, sa lahat-lahat ng yun, nakapaloob yan sa internal audit plan. Ano ang gagawin? Anong steps na gagawin ni internal auditor? Ngayon, during the duration of the audit. The IIA addresses the differences between assurance services and consulting services relative to IIA Standard 2010 Planning with Standards 2010 A1 and 2010 C1. Assurance services. The internal audit activities plan of engagement must be based on a documented risk assessment undertaken at least annually. The input of senior management and the board must be considered in this process. So, ganito. Etong assurance services kasi, assurance, di ba? Okay. So, at least annually, kailangan siya i-undertake ni company. Dito sa assurance services, from the word assurance, nagbibigay tayo ng assurance. Okay, kung tama na ba yung ginagawa ni management? Okay, kung okay na ba to? So, ina-assess niya yung existing policies, existing processes ni organization. So, may mga internal auditors sa mga company. For example, check yung cash. Oh, hindi lang naman external auditor nag-check ng cash. Meron mga internal auditors na nagsusurprise cash count. So, ngayon, pag nag-surprise cash count yan, okay, pwedeng may karoon ng internal reports na, for example, merong nawawalang ganito, okay? So, yung cash receipt and cash disbursement process is not effectively managed. So, pwedeng ganun sa assurance services. Consulting services. The Chief Audit Executive should consider accepting proposed consulting engagement based on the engagement's potential to improve management of risk, add value, and improve the organization's operation. Accepted engagement must be included in the plan. The planning process should include the establishment of goals, engagement schedules, staffing schedules, and financial budgets. So, sabi ko nga kanina, nasa internal audit plan lahat. Lahat ng step mula sa pag-establish ng goals. Ano bang gagawin sa pag-audit? Anong goal natin? And next, yung schedules, yung timing. For example, magagather ng evidence sa ganitong process for 3 days or 4 days. Nakaschedule talaga. Staffing schedule. Sino naka-assign sa pag-gather ng evidence ng cash, receipts, and disbursement? Okay? Sino mga naka-assign na tao dyan? And at the same time, the financial budget. Yung budget mismo ng internal audit team. Additionally, effective planning should reflect the internal audit charter and be consistent with organizational objectives. The planning process should be a collaborative process involving all levels of management to ensure that audit plan is understood and supported by management. Communication and approval. After the internal audit plan has been established, it is incumbent upon the CAE to present it to the senior management and the board. Typically, the audit committee to be approved. Resource requirements, significant interim changes, and the potential implications of resource limitations should all be included in the communication to senior management and the board. So, pag nagawa na yung internal audit plan, hindi kaagad yan final. Subject pa yan for the approval of the senior management and the board. The board, yung audit committee. Kung merong audit committee. Kasi nga, di ba, sabi ko, yung audit committee, usually, compose yan ng mga board of directors. So, kailangan, aprubahan muna nila. So, okay na yon. Pag okay na, yung mga possible, yung mga potential resource limitation naman, should all be included in the communication to senior management and the board. For example, baka magkulang sa tao, baka magkulang sa ganito. So, dapat na-communicate muna sa senior management and the board para malaman nila kung may dadagdag pa ba sila or paano masosolve yung limitation. The proposed internal audit plan may include, it is not required to be included, but it may include, this item may be included in the proposed internal audit plan. First, a list of proposed audit engagements and specification regarding whether the engagement are assurance or consulting in nature. Rationale for selecting each proposed engagement, for example, risk rating. Pag mataas na masyado yung risk sa department na yan or sa section na yan or part na yan ng entity, for example, mataas na masyado yung risk na nakikita o in terms sa production ng company, so therefore kailangan i-audit. Time since last audit, matagal na, 10 years ago pa nung last na na-audit yung subject ng audit ngayon, or there is a change in management. Objectives and scope of each proposed engagement, kung hanggang saan lang yung scope ng audit engagement. And the list of initiatives or projects that result from the internal audit strategy but may not be directly related to an audit engagement. Again, these items are not required to be included in the proposed internal audit plan but may be included only in the proposed internal audit plan. Organizational structure and staffing strategy. Internal audit functions should be structured in a way that is consistent with the needs and culture of their organization. Sa loob ng organization, merong internal audit functions. Usually, meron tayong tinatawag na flat organizational structure. Pag sinabing flat organizational structure, most of the internal auditors have more or less the same level of skills, experience, and seniority. Ibig sabihin, same lahat sila ng posisyon. Same lahat sila ng level of experience and skills. And their head is the CAE or the Chief Audit Executive. Yun lang. So, flat lang yung organizational structure. Little supervision is necessary in the work performed is consistent and reliable. Bakit little supervision lang? Since lahat sila may enough na experience na, may enough na level of skills na. Lahat sila nasa senior level na. So therefore, the work is more reliable. However, nasabi dito, the flat organizational structure tends to result in higher cost based due to the higher salaries necessary to retain auditors who all have a high degree of knowledge and experience. Kasi kailangan mo i-retain yung mga auditors. Though same lang sila, the level of skills and experience, same lang sila lahat ng posisyon, so kailangan sweldohan mo sila ng same lang din. So therefore, mas higher yung cost ni organization, higher yung salary ng mga internal auditors since mas may experience sila. Pero yung advantage lang nun, dahil mas may experience sila, dahil mas may skills sila, mas reliable yung performance nila. Other internal audit functions are much more hierarchical in nature, with field auditors reporting to and learning from senior auditors, who in turn report to and learn from managers and directors, who mentor those in positions subordinate to them while supporting the CAE above them. So, mas sikat, etong meron tayong iba-ibang position. So, meron tayong CAE, And then, sunod sa CAE, meron tayong directors, and then meron tayong senior auditor, junior auditor, and then staff. So, pasunod yan. Siyempre, si staff, siya yung nasa field auditor, nakapasunod yung function nila. Iba-iba sila ng skills. Okay, yung mga nasa lower position, sinusupervise sila, mini-mentor sila ng mga nasa higher position. And less na lang yung trabaho ng mga nasa higher position. More on evaluation na lang sila ng mga na-perform na work na ng mga lower position ng mga staff, ng mga field auditors. So, chine-check na lang nila. They are learning from the senior auditors, yung mga nasa field auditor, yung mga junior auditors, and the senior auditors naman, doon naman sila nagre-report sa mga managers and directors. And then, again, the head of the internal audit function within the organization is the CAE or the Chief Audit Executive. So, mas maganda kung ganito. Okay? Kung merong iba't ibang level ng posisyon or skills or experience and seniority ang bawat auditors. Internal audit functions that are structured hierarchically and tend to be more dynamic due to the fact that positions are often rotating. As the people and the positions near the top of the organizational structure move up, and sometimes out of the function, for example, nag-retire na or umalis na, syempre, at least may papalit sa kanya. And na-train na yung papalit sa kanya. The people in the subordinate positions move up into the recently vacated position. This allows for growth within the function. So, nakikita natin yung growth and leads to the cultivation of diverse skills and fresh perspective with a lower cost base. Kasi kung diretso kaagad tayo na, magagaling silang lahat. Yun lang, lugi si entity kasi nga higher salary silang lahat. Dito, lower cost base. Both types of internal audit organization, however, rely on staff members who continue to receive training and broaden their skill base. So, whether of the two organizational structure, they both need training and broadening of their skills. The typical hierarchical internal audit function includes associates in a variety of positions that correlate to specific roles within the function, including staff auditor or IT staff auditor. So what is staff auditor or IT staff auditor? Staff auditors are responsible for performing the field work on financial, operational, compliance, and informational system engagements in accordance with the established audit schedule for the purpose of determining the accuracy of financial records, effectiveness of business practices, and compliance with policies, procedures, laws, and regulations. So, sila yung naka-assign sa fieldwork. So, pag merong kailangang information, sila yung mag-accommodate ng audit work. So, when we say financial, yun yung dinidetermine nila yung accuracy of the financial records. Pwede ding operational when it comes to the effectiveness of business practices or the compliance of the company with regards to its policies, procedures, laws, and regulations. Another role is the senior auditor or IT senior auditor, sometimes referred to as an in-charge auditor. So what is senior auditor or IT senior auditor? In addition to the responsibilities na nasabi kanina sa staff auditor, senior auditors are responsible for the planning stages of an engagement. Since they are senior, kumbaga sila yung head ng mga staff auditor, they need to guide the staff auditors in their field work. So, ang gagawa talaga si staff auditor. Pero with supervision ni senior auditor. So, the senior auditor will ensure that the engagement timelines are met. So, Yung schedule kasi, 'di ba, yung established audit schedule, kailangan masundan yun ni staff auditor. And kailangan i-monitor yun, i-ensure ni senior auditor na ma-meet ni staff auditor yung schedule, yung audit schedule. So, paano niya ma-ensure? So, kailangan niyang i-supervise si staff auditor, kailangan niya i-remind si staff auditor. And at the same time, the senior auditor should review the work papers prepared by the staff auditors. Ano yung work papers? Yung working paper, nandun lahat ng results or evidence or lahat ng information pertaining to the work of the staff auditor. So, the senior auditor should review the work of the staff auditors and should assist in the preparation of the engagement communications, performing the wrap-up steps of the engagement, meaning dun na sa finalization ng audit work, and evaluating also the staff auditor's performance since they are the head. So, sila yung sunod na head galing sa staff auditor, is yung pinaka-lower, staff auditor, then next senior auditor. So, ngayon, si senior auditor, kailangan niya rin i-evaluate yung performance ni staff auditor. And next, we also have the audit manager or the IT audit manager. The audit manager supervise and administer engagement in accordance with the established audit schedule. Additionally, audit manager assessed in the development and maintenance of the annual internal audit plan and risk model for assigned areas, issue engagement communication, and supervise senior auditors. Again, si staff auditors yung head niya. Yung next level, si senior auditor. Yung next level kay senior auditor, si audit manager. So, since si audit manager, mas mataas yung position niya kay senior auditor, therefore, si audit manager ngayon ang magsusupervise kay senior auditor. And the audit manager should ensure na lahat ng ginagawa the senior auditor is akma or nandun mismo, na nakapalood mismo or in accordance mismo dun sa established na annual internal audit plan. Okay? So, nandun sa annual internal audit plan yung established audit schedule ng audit work. So, ina-assist ni audit manager or the IT audit manager yung development and maintenance of annual internal audit plan. Kasi nga si annual internal audit plan, hindi naman siya fixed. Throughout the audit work, pwedeng ma-update, pwedeng mag-change, pwedeng merong pagbabago or ma-modify yung plan. Lalo na pag merong unexpected or merong additional information or merong scope or limitation na nangyari during the audit. Next, the audit director or IT audit director. The audit director positions may exist in larger internal audit functions. Audit directors assist with the development of the overall internal audit strategy and planning, including the presentation and review of the internal audit strategy, mission, charter, and plan with the audit committee and senior management. So, si audit director ngayon, siya na yung mas involved sa communication with the audit committee, yung part ng board of directors na mismo. So, when it comes to communication, they are responsible. So, the audit directors now assist, okay, they are assisting with the development of the overall internal audit strategy. Gumagawa si staff auditor, okay, sinusupervise si senior auditor, and then ina-assist si audit manager. Ngayon, si audit director naman, siya yung siya yung responsible when it comes to the internal audit strategy and planning. After na-audit, they are responsible for the development of the internal audit strategy and planning, including, again, the presentation and review ng internal audit strategy, mission and charter and plan with the audit committee and senior management. So si audit director ngayon, i-review niya na lahat, but together with the audit committee. Note also that since yung head ni audit manager, si audit director, therefore, si audit manager is supervised by the audit director. And also, the audit directors are responsible for hiring and terminating internal audit associates. Chief Audit Executive, na-discuss na natin si CAE throughout this lecture. The CAE develops, directs, organizes, monitors, plans, and administer the internal audit plan and budget. So, umpisa pa lang kasi nandun na si CAE. Since siya yung magiging head, siya yung head talaga ng internal audit function within the organization. So, he directs, he develops, he monitors, he plans the internal audit plan and budget, pero inaaprubahan pa yan, subject to approval pa yan ni audit committee. So, for the purpose yan of determining the accuracy of financial records, effectiveness of business practices, and compliance with applicable policies. Kasi pwedeng mag-audit tayo kasi tinitingnan natin, accurate ba yung financial statements, accurate ba yung financial reports, so kailangan i-audit natin. Or kaya, effective kaya yung business practices, effective kaya itong mga policy ng company, so kailangan i-audit. Or kaya, ino-audit yung compliance ni company. Okay, may ganitong policy company na-implement kaya to sa entity. Sinusunod kaya talaga to? O kaya may pinapa-comply na ganito sa government. Nasusunod ba talaga to within the organization? So, kailangan mag-audit. The CAE also directly supervises the internal audit management team. Sino ba yung internal audit management team? Lahat ng na-discuss natin, including the audit manager and the audit director. So, sinusupervise ni CAE, si audit manager, and si audit director. And since he is the head, so the CAE oversees the entire internal audit function and approves the hiring and termination of internal auditors. Staffing plus human resources. Although some aspects of maintaining appropriate human internal audit resources are delegated to other high-level associates, and the internal audit function, for example, directors and managers, may do much of the recruiting and initial selection of candidates, the CAE must ensure that internal audit resources are appropriate, sufficient, and effectively deployed to achieve the approved plan according to Standard 2030. The CAE also must assign independent and objective human resources effectively. Remember, as we have discussed in the last slide, that the CAE is responsible for recruiting internal auditors. So the CAE must assign independent and objective human resources, meaning that internal auditors are assigned to engagements for which they are qualified and capable of performing. So, kung for example, yung i-audit is, yung type of audit is financial audit. So, therefore, dapat yung mga auditors na may experience sa financial audit ang mga dapat naka-assign doon. So, those who are qualified and capable of performing. So, kailangan i-consider yun ni CAE and assigning the internal auditors to different engagements. In some instances, individuals with specialized knowledge and or skills from elsewhere in the organization or from sources outside the organization may assist with an internal audit engagement when the necessary competencies are not present within the internal audit function. For example, kailangan nila i-assess yung value ng lupa. Within the internal audit function, walang assessor. Hindi nila kayang i-value yung lupa. So, therefore, kailangan nila yung specialized skills ng assessor. So, pwede na, for example, kukuha sila without or outside the internal audit function or outside mismo ng organization. Kukuha sila external, sa labas. Okay, mag-hire sila ng external assessor para dun sa specific na pag-assess ng land na yun, para sa work na yun. Another is for example, sa pag-value ng mga inventory, and then hindi sila marunong. For example, yung mga diamonds, yung kailangan, for example, si entity, kailangan i-value yung ganitong mga items, hindi sila marunong mag-value. So, kailangan yung knowledge or skills ng experts. So, kailangan nila mag-hire or kumuha ng experts sa labas. So, pwedeng ganun. As long as the competency that are required are not present within the internal audit function. Kasi kung present lang naman, okay lang na kayo na lang yung gagawa ng ganung work. Another example, yung mga work ng IT professionals. For example, lahat ng mga internal auditors ni organization, CPA lahat. Kailangan yung expert sa programming. Okay? Merong may alam sa computer, pero basic lang. So, kailangan yung knowledge, yung specialized knowledge sa programming. So, kung ganun, pwedeng maghanap, yung internal audit function, pwedeng maghanap si CAE from other part ng organization, outside the organization, or inside the organization but outside the internal audit function. Hiring practices. The CAE is responsible for hiring associates to fill the organizational structure of the internal audit function in a way that maximizes efficiency, effectively provides the necessary skill base, and makes good use of the financial budget. To do this, the CAE typically tries to hire individuals with training and expertise in a variety of areas, including financial accounting and reporting, IT business operations, applicable laws and regulations, and organizations industry. Since the CAE is responsible for hiring internal auditors, so therefore kailangan niya tingnan yung experience and capabilities and competency ng individuals na hinahire niya. So, syempre, nag-audit sila. So, kailangan merong alam sa financial accounting and reporting. So, kung na-assess ni CAE na kailangan nila ng IT, so mas maganda na merong alam sa IT, may alam sa business operation, may alam sa applicable laws and regulation, and may alam sa industry. For example, yung organization nila is agriculture. Nasa agricultural industry. So, kailangan yung hinahire din is may alam o may experience na sa pag-audit ng mga agricultural, or mas preferred na i-hire dapat yung may experience na or may alam na, may background na sa agricultural business. Strategic sourcing supplements the in-house internal audit function through the use of third-party vendor services for the purposes of gaining subject matter expertise for a specific engagement or filling a gap and needed resources to complete the internal audit plan. So, pag hindi enough yung resources within the internal audit function within the organization, pwede tayong mag-source out, okay, from external sa labas ng organization, from a third-party vendor services. Ibig sabihin, mag-outsource tayo. 3 lines of defense model. Governing Body Board Audit Committee, External Assurance Sources. The first line of defense, we have management controls and internal control measures. The second line of defense, financial controller, risk management, compliance, health and safety, environmental quality assurance. And the third line of defense is the internal audit. Etong first line tsaka second line of defense, kung titingnan nyo, okay, ang responsible nito is the senior management. Kasi yung management controls, nasa management yan eh. Kayo yung nagpo-put up, kayo nag-implement, kayo yung gumagawa ng controls, yung internal control measure. For example, the segregation of duty, control measure yan. Okay? Para maiwasan yung fraud, para maiwasan yung nakawan. So, merong separation of duty. Iba yung nagre-record, iba yung humahawak ng pera, iba din yung nagde-disburse, okay, iba din yung nag-approve. So, merong segregation of duty, merong internal control measures, merong management control. So, sa senior management yan. Second line of defense, financial controller, merong risk management compliance. So, meron ng mga laws and regulation within the company. Merong tumitingin, merong nag-assess, merong nag-identify within the management mismo. Okay? And quality assurance, meaning ina-assess din mismo yung controls, yung activities within the management. Yung third line of defense, dito pinapasok si internal audit. Ito, role ni governing body, ni board or ni audit committee. Okay, under sa audit committee, nandyan si internal audit function. So, ito na yung internal third line of defense. Depensa na ni organization, yung internal audit. The different lines of defense illustrated in the exhibit are outlined below. So, yung kanina, sabi nga natin, the first line of defense, management owns and takes responsibility for assessing and mitigating risk and for maintaining effective internal controls. Since sila nga yung nasa management, so they are the one who are responsible for maintaining effective internal controls. This internal line of defense is non-independent of management. Bakit non-independent? Kasi nga sila yung nagme-maintain, sila yung nag-implement, sila dapat yung mag-work with the controls within the organization. Second line of defense, different areas within the organization work together to assist and risk mitigation by facilitating and monitoring the risk management efforts of the organization. These areas are also involved in the communication of the applicable risk-related information. So, this internal line of defense also is non-independent of management. Sabi ko nga, yung first line tsaka yung second line of defense, responsibility to the senior management. So, the internal audit function coordinates with these areas by partnering on risk assessment. Ito second line of defense lang is nakakatulong to sa third line of defense. Ang second line of defense, dumarating na, kumbaga nandito na pumapasok na si risk assessment, yung financial controllers ng organization, yung assessment. Kasi within the management, nag-a-assess din sila na mga potential na risk within the organization. So, ginagamit din yun, kailangan din natin yun i-identify pag pinag-usapan natin si internal audit or yung third line of defense. The internal audit function is the third internal line of defense. Anong defense? Depensa to ni organization for mitigating risk within the organization. The key difference between this line of defense and the first two is that it is independent of management. Again, the third line of defense is internal audit. Kailangan kasi sa internal audit, merong independence. Though, employee naman siya ni organization kasi within the organization lang naman. Hinire naman talaga yung mga internal auditors. Pero dapat independent sila sa management. Bakit independent? Kasi si management, ino-audit din nila yung overall, yung business processes, yung business activities, yung financial reporting, yung compliance, pwede nila yung i-audit. So, dapat independent sila. Okay? Para walang bias sa judgment and conclusion ng mga internal auditors. Additional line of defense, in addition to the internal lines of defense described kanina, organizations also rely on external sources for assurance that their risks are adequately mitigated. Sino yung sinasabi natin external sources? For example, yung external auditing. Okay? Yung sinasabi natin, additional line of defense organization, kung gusto mo talaga ma-ensure na okay yung operation mo, edi mag-hire ka ng external, yun, may ensure natin yung objectivity pagka-independent niya. So, si internal audit function, yung organization, meron yung independence. How much more yung nasa external? Okay, yung in-outsource lang natin. Hindi naman sila hired or employee ni organization. So, pwede na another line of defense sila. So, pwede na magbigay sila ng external audit. Okay? So, yung mga CPAs naman nag-audit ng mga financial statements, that is additional line of defense para sa organization. Whether or not an organization formally includes them in its line of defense model, they do provide an additional layer of external independent assurance for the organization. Board or the board of directors, the highest level governing body. So within the organization, sila yung pinaka-head, the board of directors, or a supervisory board or a board of governors or trustees, charged with the responsibility to direct and or oversee the organization's activities and hold senior management accountable. So pag nakakita ako minsan sa mga company, yung mga board meeting, kumbaga, they are concerned with the overall success and improvement of the organization. So, oversee lang silang lahat. Ang naka-assign sa lahat ng activities is si senior management. So, ngayon, communications lang ni senior management. Yung communications niya kay board of directors, and then si board of directors, ina-assess niya yung overall na performance ni entity. As well as tinitingnan din ni board of directors yung long-term goals and long-term na mga plano, strategic plan and strategy of the entity or the organization. Governance. When I say governance, it is the combination of processes and structures implemented by the board to inform, direct, manage, and monitor the activities of the organization toward achievement of its objectives. III Standard 2110, Internal Audit Standard 2, governance requires the internal audit function to assess and make appropriate recommendation to improve the organization governance processes for making strategic and operational decisions. Again, Board of Directors is responsible for the overall strategic plan of the organization, overseeing risk management and control, overseeing lances. The senior management are the one who is responsible sa risk management and control, promoting appropriate ethics and values within the organization, ensuring effective organizational performance management and accountability, communicating risk and control information to appropriate areas of the organization, and coordinating the activities of and communicating information among the board, independent, outside, internal auditors, other assurance providers, and management. Risk management, a process to identify, assess, manage, and control potential events or situations to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievements of the organization objective. So, sinino responsibility to? Kay senior management. Pero, kailangan i-oversee to ni Board of Directors. Also, in the part, the internal audit function, ina-identify niya rin yung risk ng company. Control. Any action taken by management, the board, and other parties to manage risk and increase the likelihood that established objectives and goals will be achieved. Sa organization, meron talagang risk. Okay? Business risk or significant risk, potential or existing na risk within the organization. So, ano kailangan para ma-mitigate yung risk? Meron tayong tinatawag na internal control. So, for example, merong risk na baka may nakawan sa pera ng organization. E di magkaroon ng internal control, magkaroon ng segregation of duties. Okay? Iba yung naghawak ng pera, iba yung nag-approve, iba yung nag-i-issue ng cheque, iba lahat. Okay? Iba yung nagre-record, para merong control si entity. So, kailangan, ito yung any action taken by management to manage the risk. Okay? Hindi man mawala yung risk, pero at least ma-decrease yung likelihood na merong mangyari na hindi gustong mangyari ni Board of Directors. Management plans, organizes, and directs the performance of sufficient actions to provide reasonable assurance that objectives and goals will be achieved. Quality assurance. Ano itong quality assurance? Quality assurance is the process of assuring that internal audit function adheres to a set of standards defining the specific elements that must be present to ensure that the function operates appropriately. Etong quality assurance kasi, the internal auditor dapat must develop and maintain QAIP or Quality Assurance and Improvement Program. Merong standard sa internal auditing. Merong standard din naman sa external audit. Meron din standard sa internal audit. Etong standard na internal audit kasi, meron din tayong sinusunod na standard sa pag-audit. Yung QAIP, yung ino-audit mismo is yung internal audit function. Tinitingnan and evaluate tama ba yung ginagawa within the internal audit function. Okay? So, tinitingnan yung quality, assurance, and improvement program. Tinitingnan sa QAIP. Kung nagko-conform ba yung internal audit activity sa internal audit standards. And kung si internal auditors ba nagko-comply sa Code of Ethics. Okay? Sa external auditor, meron ding sinusunod na standard. And as well as, meron din silang sinusunod na Code of Ethics yung mga external auditors. The same kay internal auditors. Kailangan sumunod din sila, i-apply nila yung Code of Ethics sa paggawa ng internal audit activity. So, kailangan meron silang integrity, meron silang objectivity. Dapat nakikita yun within the internal audit activity of the organization. Okay? And nagko-conform sila sa standard. Hindi pwede na sila lang. Kumbaga, they have internal audit activity, pero yung internal audit activity nila is walang sistema. And at the same time, kumbaga, nag-audit sila. Pero, kasi kung wala yung QAIP, hindi ma-evaluate kung effective ba yung internal audit. Note that, yung internal audit, yan yung third line of defense na ni organization. So, mahalaga to. Minsan kasi, dito pa sa internal audit, nakikita yung mga inefficiency ni organization. Dito nakikita yung kailangan pa i-improve na areas within the organization. Dito nakikita yung failures ni organization, yung mga mali. Okay, yung dapat i-correct. So, kailangan ma-evaluate din, ina-assess din kung tama ba yung internal audit activity. And na-evaluate natin yung internal audit activity within the organization if it is still conforming with the standard, with the internal audit standards. Okay? So, ina-assess nila yung effectiveness ni internal audit activity kung nakakatulong ba siya sa control, sa risk control within the organization or sa fraud control within the organization. Or baka nag-a-assign lang ng budget kasi kailangan ma-evaluate talaga to. Kasi itong internal audit function, meron tayong budget dito eh. Baka ngayon, ang laki na ng budget sa internal audit function. Tapos, ang labas pala is wala naman pala siyang natutulong sa kumpanya. Okay? So, hindi pa rin naman pala nadadagdagan yung control within the company. Pareho pa rin yung problema. So, therefore, kailangan i-assess to para ma-identify din yung mga kailangan pang i-improve within the internal audit function. Okay? So, for example, hindi masyadong maliwanag yung structure within the internal audit function, kung paano yung communication, sino nagre-report ng ganito. So, pag nakita yun within the assessment, so kailangan itama yun. So, there is always an opportunity na ma-improve yung internal audit function pag merong QAIP. And not required to ni standard na merong QAIP within the internal audit function. The QAIP efforts also include follow-up on recommendations involving appropriate and timely modification of resources, technology, processes, and procedures. To provide accountability and transparency, the CAE communicates the results of external and as appropriate internal quality program assessments. Kasi meron tayong assessment din sa external program. For example, nag-outsource tayo ng mga external auditor. So, therefore, kailangan, meron din silang QAIP. So, ang result kasi niyan ng QAIP, kailangan i-communicate with the stakeholders of the activity. Sino ba yung stakeholders? Si senior management, si board, and si external auditors. At least annually, the CAE reports to the senior management and the board on the quality program, efforts, and results. So, kailangan, yung result, kailangan ay communicate sa mga heads, sa senior management, sa board, para malaman nila yung mga kailangan pang i-improve within the internal audit function or even in the external audit function. This closure of non-conformance, and the event that an internal audit function is found to be sufficiently deficient to impact the overall scope or operation of the internal audit activity, IIA Standard 1322 Disclosure of Nonconformance states that the CAE must disclose the nonconformance and the impact to senior management and the board. Again, the CAE must disclose the nonconformance and the impact to senior management and the board. So, pag ngayon, si internal audit function is hindi nag-comply with the standard. Kasi nga, pag ikaw internal auditors, within the work, kailangan mag-conform ka with the internal audit standards. Meron tayong internal auditing standards, the International Standard for the Professional Practice of Internal Auditing. Okay, so kailangan mag-comply sila with the standard habang ginagawa nila yung audit. Habang nag-audit sila, meron silang sinusunod na standard. So ngayon, paano pag hindi na-conform? So kailangan ba ipaalam sa management? Yes, kailangan ipaalam sa management. Sino magpapaalam? Si CAE. So the CAE will disclose the non-conformance and the impact to senior management. Ano bang impact ng hindi pagsunod? For example, hindi niya talaga nasunod overall and whole, hindi niya nasunod yung standards, yung internal audit activity. So, kailangan i-report yun sa senior management and sa board. So, ngayon, si senior management and si board, kailangan mag-decide sila kung kailangan ba ng corrective action. So, kailangan nila i-determine kung intentional ba to or nagkataon lang or hindi naman sinadya, kailangan lang talaga na mag-depart sa standard and they will decide after kung corrective action ba will be taken. Now, if the senior management and the board make the decision not to take corrective action and the internal audit function remains non-compliant, okay, wag na mag-corrective action, non-compliant na talaga sa internal audit. So, therefore, hindi na pwedeng i-state the internal auditor, the internal audit function na nag-conform sila sa standards. Again, kung walang corrective action na gagawin si senior management o si board of directors, si internal audit, non-compliant na talaga. Since non-compliant sila, then therefore, hindi nila pwedeng i-state sa internal audit report nila na nag-conform sila sa standard, sa International Standards for the Professional Practice of Internal Auditing. The consequences of continuing to offer internal assurance and consulting services that are not conducted in accordance with the standards are far-reaching and can significantly inhibit the internal audit function's relationship with interested third parties, such as regulators and other interested outside parties. Example, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Pag si internal audit function within the organization will not comply with the standard, Therefore, yung outside parties, the Securities and Exchange Commission, hindi na magtitiwala sa kanya. Or at the same time, yung interested third parties such as the regulators or the government mismo is hindi na magre-rely sa internal audit work. Kasi nga, yung work naman nila is hindi conducted with a standard. So, kailangan talaga conducted with a standard. Again, hindi pwede na state ni internal audit function na nag-conform sila sa standard kung nag-depart sila sa standard, whether intentional man yan or nagkataon lang or hindi naman sinadya or advertent. And then walang corrective action na ginawa si board of director or si senior management. This is the end of lecture 2. Thank you. God bless.